Hey guys, Palsteron here, and today let's talk about one of the, in my opinion, coolest items in the game, Stranglegasp. So a lot of people were asking me about my Carnage Heart. First they were like, why are you using Carnage Heart? And it's like, they saw the 4 Anoints and they're like, oh, how the hell does that work? We're gonna explain that in this video, but I also want to talk about where I think Stranglegasp fits into some of the biggest meta builds in general, especially for people who are willing to min-max their character. So at its core, Stranglegasp is super basic. You get your normal Anoint, but then on top of that you get 3 more. Now, that is usually not all that competitive with rares, right? You can craft up rares really decently, but on some builds, that can be approximately as good as a rare, and we're going to talk about some of those implications in a second. But where I think this amulet fits the best is for attack-based builds. Now, the reason I disqualify it for spell builds is mostly that they already have super good amulet choices to fall back onto. Even if you don't, for some reason, want to run a rare with like +2 to your element and some life, crit multi, cast speed, dot multi, you can still always fall back onto Ashes of the Stars. Hell, for a lot of builds, Ashes of the Stars is the clear winner there anyways. But for attack-based build, that's a lot different, right? You get some LE damage with attacks, crit multi, maybe a life roll, maybe you can fix your mana. But, I mean, most of these rolls are just not as impactful as a +1 is on a spell-based build. And this league with tattoos, a lot of people realize that not all attack builds have to be about Omni or Attribute stackers. Don't get me wrong, if your build is made around Omni or Attribute stackers, if that is the best version of your build, then obviously it cannot compete, especially in Attribute stacker builds. Eyes of the Great Wolf, a rare Emmy, will completely knock it out of the park. But for builds that have a different direction, now we're talking. Now, the reason Stranglegasp is so interesting is because you can actually corrupt it to a rare, and then once it's rare, also change it into a unique if you want to with tainted currency. Now, important to note is when I made this amulet is I cannot afterwards change the Anoint, and this is quite a big problem because sometimes your build changes over time. You make upgrades, you get more currency, right? But they can't be changed, which is why you need to put some fine-tuning into your build beforehand so you actually know what's going on. In my case, I just put very generic damage increases on the amulet, and whatever it bricks to, it bricks to. But the weird stuff about Stranglegasp is even if you min-max, you don't know what you're going to corrupt into, right? Carnage Heart is just one of the outcomes. And I guess something I forgot is it's also really expensive. So usually at the start of the league, it goes to like 7, 8, 9, 10 divines. And now at this point, it's already in the 30s or 40s or whatever. It is a really expensive thing to even try to go for it. I have to first go into how you actually corrupt your Stranglegasp. So what happens is you buy a clean Stranglegasp. It cannot be corrupted. It has to be uncorrupted. And then you put on the Anoints that you want. Don't forget, if you actually brick it and turn it into a rare, which is what you want, then what will happen is you can't change the Anoints anymore. So you have to get that beforehand, so you have to know what you're doing. Now, you corrupt, and now you have 4 outcomes. This basically turns into 2 outcomes because the amulet doesn't have a socket, so nothing changes 50% of the time, at least as far as I know, which is still fine on a lot of builds. That is still as good as or competitive with an okay amulet, right? Sometimes you get a corrupt implicit. For example, I get additional curse and then sold it for like 130 divines because some people want it because then they can put on Whispers of Doom and the additional curse, so they get 2 additional curses. But even if you get like res or movement speed, it's not the end of the world, but it's not really what you're here for, right? You want to turn it into a rare. And if you hit that, this is how your amulet is going to look like. You're going to get a completely random assortment of mods. Now, do note that the item level does matter here. So the higher item level it is, the better chance you have. So it does matter. But they can be completely random and they can be awful, right? Absolutely awful. But you have 4 Anoints and you have some form of stats, which in general can always be useful, right? Res can always be useful. Life can be useful. Crit multi. This guy obviously completely bricked. But if we look at some of the better ones, I guess these are already all uniques. This guy, for example, got a really good amulet. Holy moly. That's like life, double res, fizz as extra fire, and then also physical to attacks. Now, this guy actually went for the double corrupt, which means his chance to do nothing actually turns into poofing the item, which means if you want to resell, because you can still resell corrupted ones, then that is going to put a little bit of a dent into it. I personally don't like doing that because a lot of the, I mean, this is obviously a good mod probably for whatever he wanted to do, maybe, but usually they are kind of scattered and very specific, and very often you just get something you don't want at all. I'd rather have res and stats and life and like damage. But that's completely up to you. You'll have to look at the mod pool yourself. Now, what happens if you turn it into a rare? Let's say you don't get what this guy got. If you got what this guy got, obviously you don't even think about uniques anymore. No unique can beat this. But let's say your amulet looks more like this. What do? Well, you have a few options. The first thing you can do is reroll it with a Tainted Chaos Orb. Now, this is where stuff gets a little bit muddy, and I don't 100% know if what I'm saying is true in terms of chances and stuff like that. What I've been told and what I've experienced myself is it's round about a 50-50 chance that you now reroll your corrupted item with new mods completely, and the other half is what happened to me twice, is it turns into a normal item. Now, if it turns into a normal item, so let's say you Tainted Chaos Orb. Okay, let's say you hit something good, like the one guy did, you keep it. But if it turns white, you still have the option of Tainted Mythic Orbing, and then you have the chance to get a unique. So that could look like this guy who got a Hinekora Sight. Maybe that's not something he wanted. Maybe he wanted a Carnage Heart. Maybe he wanted an Estramentis or anything like that. But that is how you get those anoints on this. And the thing is, Tainted Mythic Orbs work with waiting, and stuff like Carnage Heart is very, very common. So for example, if you see people gamble with Tainted Mythic Orbs for belts, for a Headhunter or a Mage Blood, you'll see they get a lot of brick uniques. That is the same thing here. I don't have much sample size, so I don't really know. What I've heard from people, it's around about 30 to 50% that you turn a white Stranglegasp into a unique. However, like I said, that is still not as good of an outcome as getting a good rare. But at some point, you just have to keep what you can. Now, if we talk about what amulets are actually good outcomes, you have first up Carnage Heart. Obviously, Eye of Cholula is a brick. It is obviously this one right here, Eye of Cholula, which nobody uses nowadays. Everybody uses the upgraded version. It's a complete brick, and it can happen, but I don't feel like it's as common, especially not as common as Carnage Heart. A little bit common as well is Yoke of Suffering, although not as common as Carnage Heart. And Yoke of Suffering is actually GG for a lot of builds. For example, for my build, this would have been the best outcome. We get res, we get shock on our cold build. It's absolutely glorious. You can also get the Hinekora Sight, which can fix your accuracy. It's not the worst ever, right? It also gives you a little bit of flat evasion. Not too bad. And then if we're living in La La Land, we can talk about Astramentis and Dragonfang's Flight. Astramentis can solve a lot of issues. You wouldn't normally use it on a build, but once you get it for free, you'll note that these attributes can do a lot, especially this league, obviously, with tattoos, but even going forward, that is a very interesting option. And then Dragonfang's Flight, you're never going to get a +2 level that you want, even if you hit it and you can't divine it. So obviously, that's pretty bad. But what you have to focus on is it still has all LE res. It has reservation efficiency, which is huge. And it has reduced attribute requirements, which once again gives you more tattoos. All right, so I told you how to make a GG Stranglegasp into something else. Now, what can you actually use those extra anoints for? What's like the tech there? Once again, it's really good, I think, for attack-based builds mostly. Spells have better things to do. The first one is pretty obvious. Just stack the best damage you have. You go to PoE, you go to Anoint, you do hit DPS or whatever you have right here, and you will see what the best thing is. For me, it's Proficiency, which is actually tattooed into something else. But then you have Forces of Nature, which gives you Pen, cold damage Pen, right? Damage per endurance charge. Crit multi is a big one, especially for bow builds. Bow builds are very often starved on crit multi, and you can get that. You're probably going to path here anyways, but you can get stuff like Assassination if you don't path here, Throat Seeker, or even things like True Strike. But there's way more interesting stuff you can do, right? For example, Reservation Efficiency. Now, if you're somebody who doesn't even go into the middle here, you can get Charisma, Sovereignty, Influence, and all the way down here, Champion of the Cause, which is an absolute powerhouse if you're using a lot of auras and you can't really access any of those clusters the way you path normally and you don't want to go out of your way. Whispers of Doom is something a lot of people include just naturally. I couldn't fit it into this build, but it's definitely a thing you can do. Additional Curse, I mean, it's so good on a lot of builds. It saves you a lot of points. These points leading up to it are usually not worth it. Then we have Overcharged is actually a very underrated one that a lot of people don't pay too much attention to. While you're mapping, this basically gives you all charges. And some attack builds can't really get power charges or endurance charges that well. And also, quite a few builds are running Chaos Spirit, which removes your regen, and then having Blood Rage on is really annoying. So you could also alleviate that and get your frenzy charges from there. Now, charge stacker nodes is also nice. It's a little bit niche because usually if you're charge stacker, you're a badge of the Brotherhood, so it doesn't really apply to you. But for example, what I did here is I saved 1, 2, 3 points, which were really bad, and I could take Disciple. And saving 3 points directly translates into like 10% more damage. You can also fix your mana cost. What some builds are doing is they either anointing Dreamer or they are anointing Tireless, right? So you can make a combo out of that if you really want to. After that, we have wand builds, which is also quite interesting. There's a few wand builds that are now either Champion or Slayer. Some are even Deadeye, but mostly Champion and Slayer, that go a little bit more defensively. They want to be a little more well-rounded. The big problem for them is they can't really path up here to the wand nodes, and that is a huge downside because you have Fusillade, you have a Disintegration, you have Elder Power. There's a lot of good annoyance. You also have Wand Slinger, right? You have Prism Weave. So for those kind of builds, Stranglegasp is literally made for. There's also Dazzling Strike, which I was thinking about, which I could have taken. The crit chance against blinded enemies, blind effect, it gives you blind chance. It is a very, very solid anoint. Also, if you want to, you can anoint Graceful Assault for some onslaught. And then obviously the tattoo stuff. So, for example, a lot of builds that are kind of here have the problem that they don't get a dex node that they can path to. So you can just path here, put a tattoo on here, unspec these, and then anoint it, and you get, for example, +1 frenzy charge on other builds onslaught. Now this drops from only blight ravaged maps, and as I understand it, only after the encounters or from the last drop. I don't exactly know how that is determined, if it works somehow with like quantity or anything like that. I actually have no idea. I've never farmed one myself, but maybe somebody can clear that up in the comments. Maybe they know. In general, I think this is a very underrated amulet. Obviously, some people are playing it. It has huge downsides because you just need to exactly know what you're doing. But if you're somebody, if you're a tinkerer, if you're somebody who likes builds, this should always be in your mind when you make your character. And it's also a really fun gamble whenever you can do it. Way more fun than just clicking apothecaries over and over. Very specific, but if you know what you're doing, I think this can be quite strong for your build. So maybe I could give you some ideas. Maybe you learned a new thing or two. But with that being said, since I still don't have a slogan, see you next time.